This week, we're talking about research on New England church planting published in the Church Landscape Review by the Emmanuel Gospel Center. We're talking with Stacie Mickelson, the executive director of the Emmanuel Gospel Center. I'm Charles Galda, and your host for the Church in Action. Stacie, thanks for being with us.
Lovely to be here, Charles.
So maybe before we get into the data and the work that you've done on this, can you tell folks just a little bit about yourself and the Emmanuel Gospel Center?
Absolutely. I grew up in the Northeast and I grew up in church. I was one of those teens and young adults that the whole church was praying for, really caught up in the rebellion trauma cycle, one begetting the other. And the Lord very dramatically and fantastically pulled me from the fire. And I had a really strong sense of calling. And I went to grad school to get a degree in international development because I was so sure that what I felt called to must mean the mission field, but spent most of that grad degree really considering with the Lord and discerning where I belonged. And that was in my own backyard with my people. And that's what led me to the Gospel Center in Boston. But just a little personally, I've been married to my husband, Elijah, for almost 18 years. I have a 6 and a 9-year-old girl, Eden and Anna.
And what is the Emmanuel Gospel Center?
Sure. So Emmanuel Gospel Center, or EGC as most people call us, we've been around for over 85 years. And like so many other Christian ministries, we are working to empower the church to seek the holistic well-being of our communities. But the way that we do that, we like to try to think of ourselves as the R&D department or arm of the church. People need to understand their landscape. They need to have their pressing questions answered, so that they can be collaborating together on new ministry models, especially in gap areas. So we have a lot of different programming and consultation that can help create spaces of incubation and innovation. And then along the way, we want to make sure we're consistently telling quality stories of how the Spirit's at work through his people.
And you've been at Emmanuel Gospel Center for a while now, but you're in a newer role.
Yes, I've been here for a decade, which in EGC time, I'm still new by some people's terms. And last year, I moved out of the role of research director into the role of executive director.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And so, yeah, because in New England, if you're there for 10 years, we think that means you might stay and now you're worth talking to.
Exactly. And even though I'm from New England, Boston is very much that way. So you need a decade in for people to take you seriously as being rooted here.
Yeah. Sure. And so now the study that's out relatively recently on church planting actually started, though, a long time ago. So in 2014, in the beginning of the study, you talk about that this was really started then, where you guys did a study on 41 church plants back then. And so can you tell us a little bit about those, who's in the 41, how did you pick them? Racially, ethnically, size, background. Give us a little bit of the composition of that group, if you would.
Sure. So in 2014, we identified 100 church plants in the greater Boston area. So churches that had been 5 years or younger. And we ended up interviewing 41 of them. We were trying to be as diverse as possible across multiple intersections, but the ones we were primarily looking for were denominational diversity, church planting diversity, and also racial and ethnic diversity. And so that original 41 group was pretty diverse across those lines, and the type of church expression, how large those churches were, all of that was pretty diverse. But 50% of those churches described themselves as multi-ethnic at the time, and still do today.
Okay. And so you did that original study, and are there some findings you would point us to of what you had then about them?
Oh, findings about them. I think, they were new and getting their feet underneath them. I remember it was striking to me how many senior pastors had PhDs at the time. I was struck by how many hours they were working, but this is a lot of people that were coming with ideas and were starting to enact them. So we didn't do very deep dives into understanding what was happening amongst them. So it was really like a demographic scan of the church.
Okay. And so now you've gone back, though, what is this, 12 years later, 11 years later, and you've looked at those same churches again, and the 41. And how many of the 41 are still churches today?
Yeah, so 34 of those 41 are still active. 2 were unsure, despite our best efforts, and there was great ones, what their status is. 5 of them are closed, and one of those that were closed was like closed through a merger.
So that's like 90% are still there, which is pretty impressive. I think that's higher than normal church plants, certainly in New England.
It was, I confess, really surprising to me. I just anecdotally, and coming through COVID, so much movement, how hard church planting is. I would have been happy if half were around, but no, 34 are active, and there's a lot of markers of thriving that we're seeing in those churches, and that's very encouraging.
Yeah, we've been talking, and I've shared this before, that when I first got to Vision New England 5 years ago, people who'd been here for decades would be saying, hey, God's doing something different here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing a lot of people start to say the same thing, that these are unusual things we're seeing, and what God is doing in terms of interest and people stepping into churches and in ways that they haven't before. And this struck me as another one of those, to see 90% of church plants. I don't know the data nationally, but that just strikes me as a big number in New England.
It absolutely is. And we have not yet gone back and looked at those 100 churches to see if they are still around, but it is unique. Church planting is hard to study. And nationally, a lot of like researchers on the academic level have had a hard time getting with church plants. Most of the information we have is from certain denominations or certain sending networks being able to tell the story of their own network. And so this is a really unique kind of like slice in how ecumenical it was. And so we're really excited about what that means for what New England can learn about itself and what God is doing here, and also what the rest of the country can learn from what God's doing in our region.
Yeah, a lot of those denominational studies, to your point, are not terribly useful to us here, because a denomination may have done 100 plants in the last 10 years, but 2 of them might be in New England and 1 of them in Greater Boston. So that whatever happened to that one church doesn't tell us a whole heck of a lot.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
And so now, so 90% of them are still here, which is amazing. And so what did you find about? I don't want to focus too much on numeric, numbers, attendees being a mark of success, because it's not. It's about the spiritual formation. But what did you find about growth and shrinkage and stuff like that?
Yeah, thank you so much for putting it that way. So why don't I tell you about some of the things that I'm excited about, and then we can talk about growth a little bit. So first of all, those churches, when we asked them 10 years ago, how many salvations did you see in the previous 10 years of ministry? And we asked them again that question, that number has doubled. And so we're talking about double the amount of people through their ministries coming to Christ, which is amazing. Of the 21 churches that we went back and interviewed, so we didn't interview all the 21 that we interviewed, those churches have in the last 10 years planted 59 churches. Half of those in the greater Boston area, half either nationally or globally. So we really see people coming in with intentions, many of them articulating that they were planting to plant or had multiplication models built in, and they've really done that. I think something else that's striking is the churches have become more specifically missionally focused. So they are able to articulate with more precision the kinds of ministries that their community needs, and the diversity of ministry expressions has expanded. So when we're talking about the gospel in word and deed, right? People coming to know Christ, people being impacted in their communities, the gospel itself being furthered through more ministry, we see really strong thriving in these congregations. In terms of size, they've reshuffled themselves a little bit. So some shrunk, some grew a lot, some grew a little, some stayed the same. We still need to do more analysis to make meaning there, especially when you have a group of churches that are doing a lot of church planting. Making meaning of whether or not they grew or just launched out is something that we need to look at.
Yeah, because they might have been 100, then they launch a plant and they send 30 people to the plant, so it looks like they've shrunk, but in fact they're bigger because combined between the two. So I just want to go back because that sounds like an astonishing number too. So I heard you say you originally interviewed 41, 90% of them still in place. but you went and did interviews with 21 of them, so a bit more than half.
Yep.
And you found they had planted almost 3 times as many churches as they were when we started.
Exactly.
In 10 years.
Yes, and it wasn't, so out of the 21, I believe it was 12 or 13 that had done the planting. So you see this concentration of churches that have earnestly and effectively like amplified impact through growth of new congregations.
And is there something unique about those 12 or 13 who've planted now 4 times as many churches as they are, exactly. And which is amazing. And so are they coming out of, is there some traditions that are just more focused on that? Was there some commonality among them that would be maybe predictive of that's the kind of churches that multiplies well?
That is something that the team's going to need to look into more. So we have 2 reports out, our executive summary and also a demographics report. We're looking into more specific slices around sustainability, around vision, around growth and multiplication. And so we're going to have some more information out there. The churches, though, it's very interesting. They are diverse in denominational expression, and they are very diverse in terms of network connection. And so there is not enough of a majority of those 21 churches to even explain that growth. The largest number of shared denomination of the 21 is 4 churches. Similar with church sending networks. It's, I think 4 or 5 are within like the same network. And so what we're really seeing is like move of the Spirit that is outside of just one slice of people group.
And so you wouldn't be able to say that it was, for example, majority Black churches are doing this really well versus majority white, or correct. Churches in Roxbury, Dorchester do this well, right? It's just there. As of yet, apart from the Holy Spirit, there's no rhyme or reason.
As of yet in our research. And so our team leaves no stone unturned. When you're collecting, we wanted to ask every question that we asked back in 2014 so we could see shift over time. We also asked new questions this time. So they were very in-depth interviews, and it's going to take a while to be able to understand what correlations we're seeing in the data. So for example, we wanted to understand those 5 churches that were no longer open. Was there something common to them? And they were fantastically average. Church size, who the leadership was, denomination, ethnicity. There was really nothing that stood out about them in those kind of demographic measures. So the team went back to their 2014 interviews and did some narrative analysis. So that's when you're looking at someone's story, how they're telling their own story, around the questions we asked about why they were planting. And something interesting that came out is that the churches that have survived, the pastors were really clear about a personal calling, not just to ministry, but to planting, and that the church design and structure itself had a very specific goals and strategy. So it wasn't about what strategy it was, but it was that there was a strategy. And when you looked at the churches that were no longer open, these were people that felt very called to ministry, but the specificity of church planting or what their strategy was a little bit more vague. So sometimes it was like, well, this is where the ministry is, or there was denominational or network pressure that this would be like a next stage of development. So when you put the story together, you're really seeing this group of men and women coming into the area or being in the area and being launched out into plants who know what mission they're on, being about that mission through, in the last 10 years, arguably like very hard time in ministry across the nation and in the region, and thriving by all of our kind of like gospel measures, if you will. And that is really encouraging to me to see the Holy Spirit blessing the people that he's called to a specific space.
It's worth pointing out, because in that 10-year window, it's one thing to just say, well, we had the pandemic.
Sure.
But in greater Boston, the pandemic really forced more of a shutdown than was true in other places.
That's very true.
So, and if you go up into the northern states, halfway up the states, they're like, what's right? So we know this thing is going on, but, we don't know anybody who's had it. But then you go down into Boston and there's churches who've lost 8, 10, 12 people in the first 6-8 months. And so it was much more devastating there. And so churches stopped meeting for, gosh, a good year, maybe even two, some of them in person. Yeah. So that's a big challenge to keep sustainability of a church plant going during something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so now you mentioned something that I think that's worth talking about. I don't know if you looked at did you look at of the church plant team or the pastor? Did you look at how many were native to New England or Greater Boston versus coming in from outside New England?
In the original, so I know that for the original 41, it was pretty split. I do not know it for the 21, but that exists in our demographic report. My apologies.
No, don't apologize. I know you're still going through it. You just released the first report. I know you're going to do more with it.
Exactly.
But that's an interesting one, because I do get calls from folks periodically who, their pastor preaches, their pastor in Florida or Arizona preaches what a dead, dark place New England is. And they're motivated to come here and do something based on that. But it's not an easy, it's a hard place to do that, because all of your references for what you do in ministry to be a successful church plant doesn't work here.
Yes. I think that's true of New England. I think Boston and Greater Boston has a very specific and acute resistance to anything coming in from the outside, ministry models, conferences, church plants. I will say, when we were looking originally at the 41, it was less outsiders than I had thought it was going to be. Something else that's interesting, and this is just anecdotal, but there is usually pre-launch phase of church plants. So anecdotally in town, we will hear movement of people coming here to plant, but before launch, there's some false start happening. And so I think that's something of further inquiry is what is the difference between someone that's doing that beta testing? Does planting make sense? Which is a great stage to be in to determine it, and are determining, oh, no, not actually. And so I think that's something for further inquiry.
Yeah, I grew up in New England. And so I know New England, but it's not in my mind experientially of what's different in New England. I know it's different. And somebody pointed out to me one day, and this was helpful, about the point you were just making about we really are, we're standoffish, but we're certainly standoffish about the new thing. And so when I wound up preaching this, because somebody pointed out to me, I was preaching at a meeting of a national group that was in Boston. And I told them about Vision New England. We're 140 years old, blah, blah, blah. And I said, now, how many of you are from New England? And people raised their hands. I said, you heard staid, responsible, will be here for the long haul, reliable, trustworthy, right? And they're all like, yeah. I said, who's here from California? And a bunch of people raised their hand. I said, you heard useless, outdated, doesn't get it, right? And they're like, yes. Right? And so I don't know that if we all know, I didn't know that about ourselves, but it really is a big thing. It's hard to come in from the outside, and it's hard to be the new guy, because we do, as we were joking at the beginning, is we're going to wait and see, are you here for the long haul? A lot of people, as you know, come in here with that burning desire to do something to save New England. And in 2 years find out it's really hard and leave, and sometimes have disrupted and damaged things that were going on before they got here.
That can absolutely be true. And then I think in the greater Boston area, that's compounded by, because there's so many people coming in and out of town for school and residencies, people almost just don't want to treat you like a true neighbor unless you've been here for a while. And I think what you're bringing up is very interesting to me, that there are these secondary effects when you're doing ministry in a way where you don't know the environment. And people have written about this, right? This is like when helping hurts kind of stuff. And that is true. That is absolutely true. And I think for me individually, and in EGC's work, because we talk about that a lot, we train on that. I've given talks at Vision New England events in the past on that. But it really, I saw in this my own surprise with the churches being open, that some of that knowledge and protection, please be careful to not come and mess with our ecosystem, had really seeded skepticism and jadedness in my heart that God could call someone here, that the Lord of hosts could say, I'm bringing you here for this time because I am doing something here. I'm deploying those resources. And so I think hearing how many churches are around and they're thriving challenged me. Where is my own faith in my brothers and sisters in Christ, in the Spirit, and in the fact that it's pretty preposterous he called me to most anything I've ever done. I would not have chosen me, but he did anyways. And so what does that mean with church planting, which is like a high octane sport? What does that mean when we want to like be guarded against it, but we also need it? Like, don't we want more laborers in the field? Jesus told us that that's what we need to be praying for, is the laborers. But New England has this really interesting dynamic. Even people, right? You know, I know how much you're behind evangelism, discipleship, multiplication. So even these comments coming from those of us, I feel like with the natural mind, we need to hold that level of skepticism, but making sure that that doesn't transition to our heart space, because that's dangerous and at its extreme, even idolatrous. And so I'm kind of considering that for myself. Where do I need to do the role of confession before the Father, where my faith was?
Because Paul was coming from the outside, and somehow that worked, right? But Paul adapted to the culture. He's really clear about that, and that is not something everybody can do. That
is a great point.
And so there are people in New England who will tell you, when they first called me about coming here, I'm like, don't come here. There are so many better places to do ministry. It's easier in so many other places. There's proven templates. Go there. And my idea is then if they come, it's clear God's bringing them here versus just that momentary impulse. But I don't know if you saw this, if your research even tried to get at this, but what I find is there are people who are very successful in ministry from outside New England, in New England, but they figured out how to still be authentic about who they are while adapting to a very different culture and models of ministry and being innovative about that. I think the ones who struggle are the ones who, I'm still going to be the person from here. And I'm still going to try ministry the way we did here because it was so successful and I don't know another way. And those are the folks who leave after a couple of years and say, you just can't do anything in New England. It's dead. And I think the reality is, what we see is it's not dead. But it's not easy.
We all have to adapt. And, especially in the greater Boston area, I mean, it's just, even saying New England culture. So I grew up in Connecticut, in a tiny town next to Waterbury, Connecticut. And that's where I went to high school and I had my first apartment. I don't know if anybody from Waterbury, Connecticut thought of themselves as a New Englander. They would tell you their ethnic identity and they would talk about the dirty water. That was there. And so even this idea of New England culture, it's like, well, which culture are we talking about? We're not a monolith. And so that adaptability really depends to very specifically where you're planted. I do think what New England shares is a hardness and a little bit of a resistance, but it makes sense that God would need to call all different kinds of people to serve a region that is very diverse with all different kinds of people.
It's a fair point. There's tons of subcultures. We're just talking with Jim Harrell and his wife Sharon, who lead Overseed, different parts of their ministry, and we're saying the same thing. Fairfield County is not Munson, Maine. Right. But there is. Have you ever read the book American Nations? You would like that because I'm guessing one of your strength finders is context. Am I right?
It's not, but I could fake it for today.
Is that right? I would have thought it was because you got such a research background. And so and American Nations is an interesting book. Enoch Liao recommended it to me, who I know you
fantastic.
know, Boston Chinese evangelical. And it's written by a guy who's saying that we Americans use the word nations for country and nobody else does that in the world, whereas it's people groups. And he said America has never been one nation with that understanding. And he then lays out that we're 11. And then he recounts each one of those people groups coming in and why they came here, how they came here, what was important to them to come here. And then he talks about how they, the ones who come to New England, and you start to see stuff that's still with us today. And they, of course, settled some of the upper Midwest. And apparently we played a big role in filling up the West Coast, not the original group that went there, but settlers after the gold rush and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And we bring our culture with us. And, the first thing we do when we go into a town is we put up a church and we put up a school, because you need to teach kids to read, because everybody should be able to read the Bible in their own language. And so we value education. And you start to see that. And we think, and we see government as a force for good, because we're the town meeting form of government is we're the government. And so why would we be a force for bad? And it matters what you do in our community about how God blesses us. So I kind of need to mind my neighbor's business a little bit. And you see those trends in our politics and culture even today about the valuing of education. And again, you and I are both New Englanders. And so we don't realize it's not that way in Georgia. We assume
Exactly. Yeah.
right? And so he points out those differences. I found it fascinating.
Very interesting.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm surprised Strength Finders, completely off topic. I'm surprised one of your the context is not one of your Strength Finders, because a big part of your role at EGC for years has been research.
It absolutely has. So we love Strength Finders over at EGC. I think if you are leading in an organization, you want to understand your people. Strength Finders is the way to do it. And we actually looked at EGCs, like we pretended EGC were a person, and we looked at everyone's Strength Finders, like what's the little aggregate. And so many people at EGC were having some of those more like context input, ways of being, also strong belief. I'm a little bit of a different bird than everybody else in the context, which I think makes sense as a nice pairing, having a strength-based approach in the context of teams. So no, I'm a individualization person, which means I adapt to the situation or the person.
Oh, interesting.
In front of me, which is another, it brings a lot of curiosity into the research.
Now, where can folks get access to the report?
Sure.
If they're interested in reading more.
So egc.org, hit the resources page, and you'll see the reports there.
And before we go, what are some other things EGC does, services you provide, offerings that folks could plug into?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like the research is a big part of what we're doing now. We also have projects looking at how churches are using their spaces, big buildings at the intersection of community sustainability, economic growth, and also kingdom impact. We're now looking in Boston at churches that rent. So really wanting the church to have a strong understanding of its landscape. People are also coming to EGC because they have new innovative ideas and they need a place to incubate them. And so some of the ministries that are currently under EGC have to do with education, have to do with intercultural ministries and ministry to migrants, and then also our race and Christian community initiative. So helping people understand theological rootedness of why race matters and loving our neighbors.
Stacie, thanks so much for taking time to be with us today, for sharing the research, for your ministry at EGC and beyond that. Everybody loves Jeff Bass, but if Jeff can't be at EGC, everybody's excited you are, so thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Charles. It's been a pleasure.
To support this program and accelerate evangelism, go to visionnewengland.org and click on Donate, or click Member to become a partner with us. This program is supported by the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.